Thank you. Gosh, I could spend like the whole 30 minutes telling you about Don Tamaki, but that's not what you want to hear. I just do want to say a few things about him. He's one of the most distinguished and respected lawyers around, period. Often named to the top lawyers in California, recipient of numerous awards. He's just amazing. And he's going to be talking about reparations in California. But before we start on that, and maybe he plans to weave this in, there's three things I really want him to also touch on that are related. One is you are a co-founder of an organization called Stop Repeating History. I want to hear a little bit about that. You worked on the case of Sergio Garcia, an undocumented lawyer who was given a license to practice law in California, and the Fred Korematsu case. So can you just say a teeny bit about those three cases before we start talking about reparations? And I know they're all related.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. That was a brilliant performance. I have to pronounce it correctly.
I know, poor Karen, she works at it and then she says, and Irma tonight. It's like, okay, Karen, it's cool.
My middle initial is K. It stands for Kameiichi. I never use the name Kameiichi because loosely translated in Japanese, it means number one turtle. And when you're sitting around the deposition office and you have to introduce yourself, it wouldn't go over too bad. And of course, my first name is Donald, and if that other Donald runs for office again, I'm going to change my name, probably to Barack or something. But I really appreciate your performance.
Thank you.
And in a very gentle, funny, clever way, it really shines a light on exclusionary policies that really have been with us since the beginning of the country. So three cases, the one that's closest to me was reopening Korematsu versus the United States. So in 1942, the war broke out. February 19th, 1942, Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066. It puts the entire West Coast under the direction of a military commander, General DeWitt, based at the Presidio. General DeWitt starts issuing orders basically declaring that the Japanese race is an enemy race. And then within literally 2 or 3 months, Japanese Americans throughout the West Coast, and certainly the Bay Area, Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco, were rounded up into detention centers. The area here was Tanforan Racetrack, at the time it's a shopping center now, surrounded by barbed wire and machine gun towers until 10 more permanent camps were built from California to Arkansas. And ultimately, by the end of 1942, 120,000 Americans had lost their freedom, their property, some even lost their lives. They've been called internment camps, which is really, internment really refers, it's a treaty term referring to enemy aliens or prisoners of war. These were really concentration camps, actually, and they weren't death camps like in Europe, but they certainly were concentration camps. And so my parents, my family were all put there. Fred Korematsu defied the roundup orders, ultimately arrested. His case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. To his surprise, he lost. And the case stood as one of the worst cases in American jurisprudence until 37 years later, quite by accident, researchers digging around the archives uncovered intelligence agency reports from the FBI, the Navy, Federal Communications Commission, and Justice Department memos, all which said, we're about to tell lies before the U.S. Supreme Court. Japanese Americans haven't done anything wrong. They're not spying. The Army's claims that they are quote, intentional falsehoods. What do we do? And so on that basis, we reopened Korematsu's case, and ultimately it led to his criminal conviction being thrown out. And the factual foundation for the whole thing, basically the history, I'd say, of what happened was rewritten. On the Sergio Garcia case, I was part of a legal team representing the State Bar of California. And the issue confronting the State Bar, and they took the right stand, which was on the side of Sergio Garcia, that an undocumented immigrant should be able to practice law in California. In his case, his father was a green card holder. He had returned to Mexico, and his son, Sergio, was born there. He brought him over the border undocumented. He was literally under 2 at the time. He applied for to adjust his visa. The application was granted, but the process moves so slowly that 18 years later, the visa still had not issued. In the meantime, he goes to public school, does really well, goes to college, does really well, gets into law school, does really well, passes the bar. And the question is, can a person such as Sergio Garcia have the right to practice law in California? And so a couple of years later, the Cal Supreme Court, with the help of the legislature and the determination of Sergio Garcia himself, ruled that yes, and 6 or 7 states then implemented the same process for undocumented immigrants to become lawyers in their state. And there are a lot of dreamers in med school and law schools and other graduate work. And then the Stop Repeating History campaign was prompted by January 17, 2020, when Trump issues the first of thrice revised executive orders, closing the border to 6 mainly Muslim majority countries on the allegation of national security. And as you recall, people were caught literally in midair. Thousands of people, some of them running from terrorism for their lives, who had already undergone a stringent 18-month vetting program, were denied entry on their arrival or couldn't board the planes. And for the next several years, and even now, people, Iranian Americans, for instance, I talked to Google engineers who's so upset because they've been separated from their family for years on this allegation that or opening up the border or keeping the borders open would result in a threat to national security. And we decided, reassembled the Korematsu legal team to at least issue an amicus brief on behalf of this case, the adult children of Fred Korematsu, Gordon Puribayashi, and Minoru Yasui, the 3 World War II litigants who raised this issue of identifying by a racial group or religious group and labeling them as a national threat. The case was decided in Trump versus Hawaii, and by a 5-4 decision led by Chief Justice John Roberts, the Muslim ban was upheld. Justice Sotomayor wrote a scathing dissent, cited our brief, and basically said the court has substituted one gravely wrong decision, referring to Korematsu, for another. And Chief Justice Roberts said, some remarks about Korematsu being overruled in the court of history, but then promptly pivoted in the same breath to uphold the Muslim ban. So really, the Korematsu precedent, terrible precedent, just got imported into a new vessel, which is Trump versus Hawaii. We're on the losing side of that, but we formed an organization basically to educate the public on the perils to democracy. When racism and bigotry shouts louder than the Constitution, this is what happens. And we're seeing it replay out in real time in January 6th. And even now, where literally millions of people believe that the election was invalid when there's absolutely no evidence. It's testified in 60 court cases that would have made a difference in the outcome. So, we've got serious challenges to democracy, but race and this culture of prejudice is right at the center of that dislocation.
So that brings us to this task force that you were appointed to by Governor Newsom. How did that come about?
Well, as you already know, on May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was murdered and captured on 9 minutes and 29 seconds of excruciating video. So triggered the largest protests in American history, calling for a racial reckoning. And within months, the California legislature passed Secretary Shirley Weber's bill to create a task force to study and make recommendations and proposals for reparations for African Americans. So that we've been meeting since June of 2021, and the task force recently released in June of this year an interim report is called. It's a nearly 500-page report documenting the harm of 246 years of enslavement, 90 years of Jim Crow, decades more of discrimination, and connecting the dots, leading to the outcomes which we have today in our cities, in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in housing, and so on. And of course, this is an older crowd, my generation, so to speak. You remember that in 1968, there was a presidential commission called the Kerner Commission to investigate the causes of uprisings that were happening in Detroit and other major cities. And the Kerner Commission issued a report that America's heading toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, and basically predicting that unless there was some intervention, things are going to get exponentially worse. Well, sadly, every one of those predictions of the Kerner Commission report came true, and we're left with the consequences we have now, which is, with respect to education and housing, America is as segregated today as it was in the 1940s. And because of the historical exclusion, some of that you talked about, Irma, about housing and the loans and so on, where African Americans in particular were systematically cut out from benefits that really created America's middle class. And one of them was the GI Bill, federally insured loans, the Federal Housing Administration, and so on, in which, between the late 30s and the 1940s, literally $120 billion were issued in loans, but 98% of those went to white people. So this sort of accumulating, cascading consequences is covered by this interim report. And then our next task is to determine what is California's role in this. I mean, this was a national event, a national horror show, but California was plenty complicit in the institution of slavery and importing much of Jim Crow into California. So what is California's responsibility on this? And what should the repairs be? And so then over the next 8 months, we're going to have another hearing. We've been having 10 hearings so far. The next one will be in December 14th and 15th in Oakland to begin this process of discussing specific remedies.
What are some of the options you think may be considered or are already being considered?
Well, just to give you some background, I'm one of 9 members on the task force. I'm the only one who is not African American. And so I treat that with great respect and deference. On the other hand, I'm one of the few communities, belong to one of the few communities that in terms of modern day reparations, move the government to at least acknowledge a wrong and provide some measure of atonement by monetary, payment. So that's one of them, in terms of the wealth gap itself. I mean, because of this accumulating, cascading consequences of centuries, really 400 years we're talking about, For example, white households have 9 times the assets of black households. African Americans have shorter life expectancies than the rest of the population. Black women suffer 3 to 5 times more infant and other mortality rates themselves as compared to other populations. And so, how do you deal with that? And some of it, is addressable in compensation, but other things would have to be policy, oriented. I don't know what they're going to be. We're discussing that right now. But June, legislatively, the recommendations have to come out June of 2023.
Can you say something about the reparations that were paid to the Japanese community?
Yeah, so just to sum up this really fast, when my parents got out of the concentration camps, and people in the Bay Area, for example, returned to the very communities that exiled them in the first place, nobody talked about this. So traumatized. And the younger generation born, either they were very little in the camps like Justice Tashima that you referred to, or they were born after the camps, began asking questions about what happened. And gradually a movement developed because the history had been so erased. And frankly, we didn't know who we were. I mean, when you talk about identity and name and how do you pronounce yourself, where you're from, we didn't know who we were. And so a movement developed that culminated in the national movement to at least pass legislation to study this. And that was the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians in 1980. It was a study bill. And then 8 years later was a reparations bill called the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, in which it provided $20,000 per surviving incarceree who was alive at the time the legislation passed, and if they died in the camps or they died after the camps, they got nothing. So out of 120,000, 80,000 were compensated by $20,000 each, an apology, and also an educational fund, developing curriculum and making this sure it gets into the schools so we teach this history. There's no equivalence between what Japanese Americans suffered and what black people have suffered in America, period. But it is one example that in modern day where some atonement was passed. And I gotta tell you, it was a healing event for our community to be acknowledged. I mean, when people think about reparations, they immediately think about money. And certainly it's that, because the Japanese Americans, they lost their businesses, they lost their homes, many came back homeless. They had to start all over. The African American community following enslavement in every era that followed, and the deprivation and the theft of wages, property, everything else is incalculable. It's in the trillions. But to at least be acknowledged and to begin that process of healing is really, really important. We knew that, and we know that as Japanese Americans. So it's a lot more than just the, check in the mail kind of thing.
One of the things that I was struck by, and that all of you all have experienced, is that after the murder of George Floyd, so many people really made it their job to learn about the history of the treatment of black people in our country in a way that I had never seen before. And I think that there is a sense that we need to do something to address racism, but not sure how to do it. And then there's the problem of, well, what about the American Indians? And what about this group and that group? And while I know Eva Patterson always talks about there is no oppression Olympics, there is some hierarchy in how this is played out.
Well, yeah, there's no question about the wrong. I would just say generally, for instance, there's lots of racial hate incidents against Asian Americans now. I have to say, volume-wise, the number pales against the hate incidents against African Americans. That hasn't gotten, as much publicity. I think that's part of the racial hierarchy, we're talking about. But in order for me to be self-interested in terms of protecting my community, I'm beginning to realize you don't stop anti-Asian American hate or anti-Jewish hate or anti-Latino hate until you figure out where the hate comes from in the first place. And it comes from 1619. I mean, that's the one thing I've taken back from the reparations. And why is the Japanese American, involved in this? And I've asked that, and I believe when I've asked that question, I now juxtapose two historical events to sort of explain it, because I think it illustrates what, and it's personal to me, so I have a way to relate to this. So in 1943, James Wakasa, he's 63 years old. He's confined in the same concentration camp, Topaz, Utah, as Fred Korematsu, my mother and father, and about 10,000 other Americans. So one evening, Wakasa takes a stroll along the barbed wire fence line. From 300 yards away, a guard atop a guard tower aims at him, fires a shot, bullet pierces chest, Wakasa dies. No inquest is held. The guard is exonerated, claiming that Wakasa was trying to escape. 2 years later, 1945, the Odell Short family in Fontana, California, are about to move into the house he built there in that suburb. Sheriff approached him, basically says, "Go back to your black neighborhood." The real estate agency says to him, "Vigilantes had a meeting here last night. If I were you, I'd get the hell out of here." 2 weeks later, the house explodes. Odell Short, his wife, Helen, daughter, Carol Ann, 9-year-old son, Barry, all perish. Neighbors see Helen trying to beat back the flames, consuming her children. The San Bernardino District Attorney concludes this was an accident. California Attorney General decides no evidence of vigilante activity in Fontana could be found. So the question is, what ties these two seemingly unrelated events together, other than the fact they occurred literally almost at the same time, within 2 years of each other? And I think the answer is that the hate that resulted in the deaths of James Wakasa and the Odell Short family came from the same place. The racism that propped up the institution of slavery and its aftermath. And why do I say that? Because slavery has existed since the dawn of civilization. It's thousands of years old, but it's only in the last 400 to 500 years that European enslavers developed a type of enslavement based upon race and skin color to permanently subjugate in multi-generational fashion, not only the person immediately enslaved, but their children, their children's children, etc. And once the culture can dehumanize people basically to the level of pigs and goats, in the words of Martin Luther King, thingifying them, then any manner of crimes against humanity can follow without a second thought. And once slavery ended at the end of the Civil War in 1865, but the hate morphed into different forms. You covered them, the segregation, the exclusion. And this hate not only put a target on the backs of African American people, but also on the backs of people like James Wakasa. And in California, for example, 1868, Democrats rose to power here by proclaiming, not only African Americans would not be equal, but Native people and Chinese Americans. There were very few African Americans in California at the time. So hate groups just substituted in a new target. And so between the late 1800s and 1935, about 352 people in California were lynched. 8 of them Black Americans, the rest mainly Chinese Americans, Native people, and Latinos. And so the hate just sort of recirculated in other ways. And it affects everybody, okay? The LA City Council is a great example where it becomes so pervasive and part of this culture that it's so normal we don't even recognize it as wrong until it's captured on videotape or something like that. And so basically that was that is the reason that ties everything together. And so by unpacking and shining a light on where the hate comes from and fighting this issue of critical race theory and teaching what happened, I think it acknowledges an unacknowledged party, injured group, classic group, but it also is the fix for our society. And race is, slavery is the original sin, and it's never been addressed.
I'm going to open it up to questions because I'm sure some of you have some. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm in law school right now, and you mentioned like the Supreme Court case and how it was ultimately decided by probably conservative-minded people, and I feel like there is like a very organized right where they're getting people into judicial clerkships through this pipeline of like think tanks and money from law school, and it feels really scary because we're losing rights. Do you think that we should fight against that with some sort of organization?
Oh, definitely. What we're seeing, the result of which on the U.S. Supreme Court was the end result of a few decades of planning and getting people in the pipeline. And the end result in terms of what we're seeing now in the polarization is really the battle that resulted in who's representing in the state houses. And those in turn reflect the candidates that come through the primaries. So absolutely, people have to be organized. They have to vote and not relinquish that power. It's helpful to look at every era, and if anybody has the time to look at this interim report, you can Google California Reparations report, and you'll find it's free, 13 chapters, but it covers every era and we kind of think that, well, this was sort of a morphing kind of hate that just happened and people weren't consciously purveying this stuff. But of course, it reveals every single era was planned. And if you like, for instance, and lawyers were very much a part of this. If you look at the redlining maps of the Bay Area, just the Bay Area, that were developed in the 40s, that ended up devaluing Black homeowners' homes and excluding them from the suburbs and their ability to move. And you line up those maps with the red lines being, the blackest and most segregated parts of the Bay Area because of this long history, against the pre-gentrification maps that exist today. The most impoverished, underserved, polluted communities line up exactly with the red line maps. So these were planned outcomes. They're not, and lawyers were very much a part of that. So the planning that has gone into this, we need the same amount of planning to get our way out of it. And but becoming aware of what went on is, I think, the first step.
Yes. Oh, and then Lisa. Okay.
Okay. So I had a question, I guess, primarily about how you put a price on trauma. What exactly allows you to define what kind of reparations are necessary? How do you come up with them? What can account for countless years of trauma, countless experiences of trauma?
Yeah, and the answer is there isn't any answer. There really isn't. If you were, Solomon Northrop, who was a free black man until he was kidnapped and then enslaved for 12 years and wrote the book 12 Years a Slave. He writes about a enslaved woman named Eliza, whose children are taken away, and she begs the buyer to buy her as well and not separate her from her children. And ultimately, they refused, and they were using the young girl in a few years to be, for sexual exploitation. And she dies because grief. There is no price tag for that. You can put a price tag, and as economists have done it, over just stolen labor. And you put a reasonable interest rate on it that compounds over time, 3%, say. And never mind about wrongful death and emotional distress. That's in the trillions. It's really uncompensable in some ways. But like I said, the reparations thing is not just money, although money is a big deal of it, but it's also recognition, acknowledgement of you as a human being, of not being dehumanized, that you are an American, have a rightful place in this country. And that's part of the healing too. So I could tell you in the Japanese American reparations movement, the losses were so huge, they didn't even try. Where did they come up with the $20,000? It's out of thin air. And it was like, okay, what's a number that would make the apology meaningful? If they said, we apologize, goodbye, you don't get any sense that that's genuine. And so it had to be big enough to make a point and meaningful enough, and they arrived at this number. But to answer your question, there isn't any answer, I think. I mean, your point is very well taken. You can't put a price tag on it. But that doesn't mean you can't do something about it. Yeah.
Lisa, that's the last question, and thank you. You've been very patient. Yes.
I was just curious, Dawn. I'm going to go look at the report now that I know that it's out, but
Yep.
I saw a request for comments asking whether or not the panel should limit reparations to people that could trace their ancestry to slavery or people that were black in America, which is, more expansive. Where did you guys land?
That's a
Did you
really good
answer
question.
that?
It was very controversial. There are 9 people on the task force, and it split 5-4. The black community is about 40 million in the United States, about 2 to 3 million in California. About 10% of the black community are immigrants coming from Jamaica, Brazil,
Right.
Haiti, Nigeria, Congo. Some of those places had slavery as bad as in the Americas. Some of those places didn't have slavery in that sense. And so the legislation, there are very active groups who want recognition for a class of people that have not been recognized. And that is descendants. In many ways, in the civil rights movement in particular, the society was transformed, the doors were open, and the feeling was, and everybody else walked through it. And so I think now is there a sense that this unacknowledged class of people should be recognized. On the other hand, there's anti-black, there's damages directly connected to slavery and Jim Crow pre-1900, no
Right.
question. And those people are descendants. On the other hand, anti-black bias and hatred. Derek Chauvin probably could care less whether George Floyd was a descendant of an enslaved person in America or an immigrant. The only thing that mattered to him was he's black. And so you have policing, public health issues, housing, employment, those things that are not easily solved and repairable by tracing lineage.
Right.
And so I think the task force, I mean, we voted 5-4 to recognize that specific harm class of slavery and its aftermath. But I think the task force will also have to deal with not only compensation to that injured class, but stopping the harm. It's one of the principal precepts of reparations is guarantees of non-repetition. Well, how do you do that? Policy and other things. So and we'll have to work that out, but it's been quite controversial.
Please join me in thanking Don for sharing